You find yourself standing in the opulent banquet hall of a medieval castle in 1348. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat, exotic spices, and something else. Something that makes your stomach turn even as the candlelight dances across silver platters, laden with what appears to be the finest cuisine money can buy. Silk-clad nobles laugh nervously as servants present dish after elaborate dish, but there's an undercurrent of tension in the room, as if everyone knows something they're desperately trying not to think about. The centerpiece of this magnificent feast isn't what you think it is, that golden goblet being passed around the high table. It's not filled with wine, that delicate pâté being spread on fresh bread. The main ingredient isn't listed in any cookbook you'd want to read, and that mysterious dark stew being ladled into bowls with such ceremony. Well, let's just say the secret ingredient would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. This isn't the story of weird historical diets or exotic delicacies that happen to gross out modern sensibilities. This is the story of how human desperation, cultural blindness, and sheer survival instinct created culinary traditions so horrifying that even discussing them requires a strong stomach and careful language. We're about to dive into the forbidden cookbook of human history, where the line between medicine and murder, between survival and something far darker, disappears entirely. Behind the golden facades of civilization's greatest banquets, a darker truth was being served on silver platters. What people consumed during humanity's most desperate hours wasn't just about satisfying hunger or following cultural traditions. It was about crossing moral boundaries that would make modern society recoil in absolute horror. Yet these practices were so normalized that they were prescribed by doctors sanctioned by religious authorities and served at royal tables across multiple continents. Tonight, we're opening the most disturbing files in history's pantry, examining 7 cases where human appetite met human atrocity, and discovering that some recipes should have stayed buried with the civilizations that created them. Because when you combine desperation with cultural acceptance and a complete misunderstanding of basic human decency, you don't just get unusual food choices. You get systematic practices that redefined what it meant to be human. Before we enter this cursed kitchen where civilization's darkest meals were prepared, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you hearing this story? I love knowing our community spans every corner of the globe, all of us drawn to those moments when official history reveals the appetite horrors lurking beneath the surface. Welcome to the archives, where we learn that some hungers should never be satisfied. Let's start with what appeared to be perfectly reasonable culinary traditions in various cultures around the world. After all, every society has foods that seem weird to outsiders, but make perfect sense within their own cultural context. The Romans enjoyed their garum, a fermented fish sauce that smelled like a dumpster fire, but apparently tasted divine. Medieval Europeans thought sugar was a spice and used it to season meat. Asian cultures have been eating insects for millennia, which honestly makes way more environmental sense than our modern obsession with beef. So when we talk about unusual historical foods, we're not starting from a place of cultural superiority. Every society develops dietary practices that seem bizarre to outsiders, but are perfectly logical within their own context. The Inuit traditionally consumed seal oil and whale blubber because those were the available sources of fat and vitamins in an Arctic environment where vegetables don't grow. Pacific Island cultures developed complex fermentation processes to make toxic plants edible because those were the resources their environment provided. The problem begins when you start examining the more exotic ingredients that various cultures considered not just acceptable, but actively beneficial. Medieval European medicine, for instance, recommended consuming fresh blood as a treatment for epilepsy. Now, drinking blood sounds pretty extreme to modern ears, but if you believe that seizures were caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and that fresh blood could restore that balance, it wasn't completely irrational. The Roman physician Galen wrote extensive treatises on the medical benefits of consuming various bodily fluids, and his authority was so respected that his recommendations influenced European medicine for over 1,000 years. Traditional Chinese medicine included ingredients that would raise eyebrows in any modern pharmacy. Powdered rhinoceros horn tiger bones and bear gallbladders were all considered essential components of various medicinal preparations. Again, if you believed that these animal parts contained essential life forces that could be transferred to human patients, the logic held together within that worldview. The fact that these practices drove multiple species to near extinction is a modern concern that wouldn't have occurred to practitioners who genuinely believed they were saving human lives. Arabian physicians developed their own exotic medical traditions. They prescribed powdered pearls for digestive disorders, ground precious stones for various ailments, and created elaborate elixirs combining rare minerals with, well, let's call them organic ingredients of questionable origin. The medical logic was that rare and expensive ingredients must possess correspondingly powerful healing properties. If something was difficult to obtain, it had to be therapeutically valuable. But here's where things start getting uncomfortable. As we dig deeper into historical medical texts and cultural practices, the line between exotic ingredients and something far more disturbing begins to blur. Medieval European apothecaries didn't just sell herbs and minerals. They also stocked what they euphemistically called mummy powder, which was exactly what it sounds like: ground-up human remains imported from Egypt. The logic was that ancient Egyptians had mastered the art of preserving life essence in death, so consuming their mummified remains would transfer that preservation power to living patients. The demand for mummy powder became so intense that it created an entire industry. Egyptian tomb robbers weren't just stealing golden artifacts, they were harvesting bodies for the European medical market. When authentic Egyptian mummies became scarce, enterprising merchants began creating fresh ones. They would take recently deceased bodies, coat them in pitch and spices to simulate the mummification process, then age them in ovens to create that authentic ancient look. European doctors were unknowingly prescribing recently manufactured corpses as medicine. But hey, if it looked old and Egyptian, it must be therapeutically valuable, right? The supply chain extended across multiple continents. Venetian merchants established trade routes specifically for importing human remains. English apothecaries maintained extensive catalogs of human-derived medicines with detailed price lists and quality grades. German physicians wrote scholarly treatises comparing the therapeutic values of different preservation methods and regional sourcing practices. Things get even more unsettling when you examine what was happening in royal courts across Europe. King Charles II of England consumed something called the King's Drops, a medicine made from powdered human skull mixed with various herbs and alcohol. This wasn't some folk remedy prescribed by a village wise woman. This was cutting-edge medicine endorsed by the Royal College of Physicians and prepared by the most respected apothecaries in London. French royalty developed even more elaborate preparations. Court physicians created complex recipes combining human brain tissue with exotic spices and precious metals. The logic was that royal medicine should incorporate the finest ingredients available, and if human organs were therapeutically valuable, then only the highest quality human organs were suitable for royal consumption. The Spanish court took these practices to new extremes. Philip II maintained a private pharmacy stocked with human-derived medicines sourced from across the Spanish Empire. Colonial administrators received specific instructions to preserve and ship human organs back to Madrid for royal medical use. The global reach of Spanish colonial power created unprecedented access to, well, let's call them alternative medical ingredients. The truly disturbing part is how normalized these practices had become. Medical textbooks from the 16th and 17th centuries contain detailed recipes for preparing various human body parts for medicinal consumption. They discuss the relative therapeutic values of different organs, the proper seasons for harvesting, and the most effective preparation methods with the same clinical detachment that modern medical texts use to discuss pharmaceutical compounds. University medical programs included formal training in human-based therapeutics. Students learned to identify quality ingredients, master preservation techniques, and calculate appropriate dosages for different conditions. Medical licensing examinations tested candidates on their knowledge of human-derived medicine preparation and administration. The geographic scope was staggering. Trade networks carried preserved human organs from northern European battlefields to Mediterranean medical centers. Asian merchants imported European processed human medicines while exporting their own traditional preparations. Islamic medical centers developed their own human-based therapeutic traditions while maintaining diplomatic silence about the obvious theological contradictions. So let me pause here and make sure we understand what we've discovered so far. We have documented evidence of European medical authorities prescribing fresh human blood as epilepsy treatment. We have an international trade network dealing in human remains disguised as ancient Egyptian medicine. We have royal physicians preparing medicines from powdered human skulls. We have university medical programs teaching systematic human-based therapeutics. And we have medical textbooks treating human body parts like ingredients in a cookbook. This isn't starting to sound like exotic cultural practices anymore. This is starting to sound like we've stumbled into evidence of systematic, well, let's call it alternative protein consumption, for YouTube's sake, but I think we all know what we're really talking about here. Welcome to the Historical Autopsy, where we examine 7 case files that reveal how desperation, cultural blindness, and sheer human appetite created practices so disturbing that even acknowledging them requires careful language and strong stomachs. Case File 7, the Roman Refreshment. Stand picture the Colosseum in full swing. Gladiators are providing the afternoon's entertainment. Crowds are cheering, vendors are selling snacks, and in the medical tent behind the arena, something deeply disturbing is happening. Roman physicians had discovered that fresh human blood consumed immediately after violent death could allegedly cure epilepsy. Not just any blood, mind you, but blood from young, healthy individuals who had died in peak physical condition. The logistics were grimly efficient. Wealthy Romans suffering from seizure disorders would pay premium prices to drink warm blood directly from fallen gladiators. The medical theory was that epilepsy resulted from spiritual weakness, and consuming the life force of someone who had died courageously in combat would transfer their strength to the patient. Pliny the Elder wrote detailed instructions for this treatment, specifying that the blood must be consumed while still warm, preferably within minutes of death. What made this particularly disturbing was how organized it became. Arena officials developed protocols for identifying the freshest sources, medical attendants had procedures for rapid collection, and wealthy patients had reserved seating areas where they could consume their medicine with appropriate privacy and dignity. This wasn't desperate survival behavior. This was medical tourism with a side of, well, let's call it alternative beverage service. The practice spread throughout the Roman Empire. Military physicians recommended that soldiers consume the blood of fallen enemies to gain their courage. Wealthy families kept slaves specifically for medical emergencies, ready to provide fresh ingredients when family members fell ill. Provincial governors established official protocols for medical harvesting from execution sites. The cultural logic was so thoroughly normalized that consuming human blood became as routine as taking aspirin. Roman medical texts describe quality grading systems for different sources. Young gladiator blood commanded premium prices. Blood from executed criminals was considered lower quality but more affordable. Military sources were prized for their supposed courage-enhancing properties. Age, health status, and manner of death all affected market pricing in what became a sophisticated medical commodity system. But if you think the Romans were extreme, wait until you see what happened when medieval Europe decided to turn this into a full-scale industry with quality control standards and monks as quality assurance managers. Case File 6, the Medieval Pharmacy. Horror. Medieval Europe took the Roman approach and industrialized it. Apothecaries across the continent stocked what they called medicinal preparations derived from human sources. Powdered human skull was prescribed for headaches because obviously the medicine should match the ailment. Ground human heart was recommended for cardiac conditions. Dried human liver was sold as a treatment for hepatic disorders. The supply chain was elaborate and surprisingly well documented. Monasteries often served as processing centers, with monks carefully preparing and cataloging various human-derived medicines. Execution sites became harvesting locations with official agreements between courts and medical suppliers. Battlefield salvage operations collected raw materials from war zones for processing into therapeutic compounds. Professional body merchants developed sophisticated preservation techniques. They created standardized processing methods, established quality control protocols, and maintained detailed inventory systems. Medieval account books list human organs alongside normal trade goods, with the same matter-of-fact documentation used for spices and textiles. The most disturbing aspect was the quality control. Medieval medical texts contained detailed instructions for identifying the best sources. Young, healthy individuals were preferred over old or diseased ones. Violent death was considered superior to natural death because the life force was supposedly more concentrated. Specific body parts were harvested during particular seasons for maximum potency. Monastic libraries preserved extensive collections of recipes and preparation techniques. Monks copied and distributed medical texts containing human-based formulations with the same scholarly attention they devoted to theological works. Some monasteries specialized in medical preparation, developing reputations for superior quality, human-derived medicines that attracted customers from across Europe. The geographic distribution network was remarkable. English merchants exported processed human organs to continental markets. Germanic traders specialized in battlefield salvage operations. Italian city-states became processing centers for Mediterranean distribution. French apothecaries developed luxury human-based medicines for aristocratic markets. What's really chilling is reading medieval account books that list these ingredients alongside normal medical supplies. 2 pounds of dried rosemary, 1 ounce of ground cinnamon, 3 human livers, assorted finger bones. As if they were ordering office supplies rather than organizing systematic, well, we'll call it alternative medical sourcing. Of course, all of these carefully organized medical systems assumed a steady supply of ingredients. But what happened when entire cities were cut off from their normal sources and had to become self-sufficient? That's where things get really dark. Case File 5, the Siege Survival Protocol. When cities came under siege and food supplies dwindled, populations faced choices that tested the absolute limits of human morality. The siege of Leningrad during World War II lasted 872 days, and by the end, residents had consumed everything remotely edible in the city. Everything. Leather boots, wallpaper paste, sawdust, and eventually, well, the authorities tried very hard not to document what came next. During the siege of Paris in 1870, the same pattern emerged. First went the horses, then the zoo animals, then the pets, then the rats, and finally, the morgue started reporting inventory discrepancies. Official records are diplomatically vague, but survivor accounts describe practices that crossed every moral boundary civilized society had established. The siege of Stalingrad produced similar documentation gaps. Soviet authorities maintained detailed records of military casualties and civilian deaths, but certain mortality statistics were classified for decades. Post-war investigations revealed evidence of survival practices that even hardened military investigators found difficult to document in official reports. The psychological progression was remarkably consistent across different sieges throughout history. Week 1, tighten belts and ration carefully. Week 4, start eating pets and leather goods. Week 8, raid graveyards for anything recently buried. Week 12, stop asking questions about where the meat is coming from. The human capacity for moral flexibility under extreme duress is both remarkable and absolutely terrifying. Medieval siege records show the same patterns. The siege of Jerusalem during the Crusades, the siege of Orleans during the 100 Years' War, the siege of Constantinople during the Ottoman expansion all produce similar documentation gaps and euphemistic official reports. Military chroniclers developed coded language for describing survival practices that couldn't be explicitly documented. What makes siege survival particularly disturbing is how quickly social taboos collapsed under pressure. Communities that had spent centuries building elaborate moral frameworks around the sanctity of human life discovered that those frameworks were surprisingly fragile when faced with genuine starvation. The choice wasn't between good and evil. It was between dying with clean consciences and living with souls that would never recover. Now siege survival was at least driven by desperation. But the Renaissance took these practices and elevated them to high art, complete with celebrity chef endorsements from the most famous minds in history. Case File 4, the Renaissance. Recipe book. During the Renaissance, European medicine became even more systematic about incorporating human ingredients into therapeutic preparations. Andreas Vesalius, the father of modern anatomy, recommended consuming fresh human brain as a treatment for mental disorders. Paracelsus, the renowned physician and alchemist, developed complex recipes combining human blood with various minerals and herbs. The preparation methods were disturbingly sophisticated. Renaissance medical texts describe aging processes, fermentation techniques, and careful preservation methods designed to maintain the therapeutic properties of human-derived medicines. They developed quality grading systems with premium prices paid for ingredients sourced from young, healthy individuals who had died violently. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies included detailed notes on the medicinal properties of different human organs. His scientific notebooks contain recipes for human-based medicines alongside his famous anatomical drawings. The same intellectual curiosity that drove Renaissance artistic innovation also drove systematic investigation of human consumption for medical purposes. Italian medical schools became centers of innovation in human-based therapeutics. Universities in Bologna, Padua, and Florence developed specialized curricula teaching students to prepare and administer human-derived medicines. Medical licensing examinations tested candidates on their knowledge of human anatomy, not just for surgical purposes, but for therapeutic harvesting and preparation. What's particularly chilling is how these practices were integrated into legitimate medical education. Medical students at universities across Europe receive formal training in human-based therapeutics. They learn proper harvesting techniques, optimal preservation methods, and appropriate dosages for different conditions. This wasn't folk medicine or desperate survival behavior. This was cutting-edge medical science endorsed by the most respected institutions in European society. The customer base extended far beyond desperate invalids. Wealthy merchants consumed human-derived medicines as general health tonics. Royal families maintained stockpiles of preserved human organs for emergency medical use. Even Catholic priests, despite official church prohibitions, quietly obtained these medicines for personal use while publicly condemning the practices. The Renaissance gave us the scientific method, but some cultures went even further and built their entire religious and philosophical worldview around these practices. They didn't just normalize the unthinkable, they made it sacred. Case File 3. The Cultural Justification Machine. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how various cultures developed elaborate philosophical and religious frameworks to justify these practices. Aztec civilization built an entire religious system around the ritual consumption of human heart, which they believed was necessary to maintain cosmic balance and ensure agricultural fertility. The consumption wasn't random or chaotic. It was highly organized and ritualized. Priests underwent years of training to properly prepare and consume human organs according to precise religious protocols. The victims were often volunteers who believed their sacrifice would ensure their community's survival and their own spiritual elevation. The cultural logic was so thoroughly integrated that refusing to participate was considered selfish and spiritually harmful. European cultures developed their own justification systems. Medical authorities cited ancient Greek and Roman precedents to legitimize human-based medicine. Religious leaders argued that using human remains for healing purposes honored the deceased by giving their death continuing meaning. Legal scholars created frameworks that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of human utilization. The most sophisticated justification systems emerged in traditional Chinese medicine, which developed elaborate theories about the transfer of life essence through consumption of various human-derived preparations. These weren't desperate survival measures. They were core components of sophisticated medical traditions that commanded respect across multiple cultures and centuries. When you combine religious justification with medical demand and cultural acceptance, you get the inevitable next step: professional business operations with customer service standards and bulk discount pricing. Case File 2: The Market Economy of Horror. By the late medieval period, the demand for human-derived medicines had created genuine market economies. Professional grave robbers developed territory agreements and pricing structures. Executioners sold harvesting rights to the highest bidders. Battlefield scavengers operated legitimate businesses with established customer bases and quality guarantees. The pricing structures reveal how normalized these practices had become. Fresh ingredients commanded premium prices over preserved ones. Young, healthy sources cost more than old or diseased ones. Specific body parts had established market values based on their perceived therapeutic properties. Account books from medieval apothecaries list human organs alongside normal trade goods with the same matter-of-fact documentation. What's particularly disturbing is how the market created incentives for increased supply. Execution rates increased in some regions specifically to meet medical demand. Grave robbing became so common that wealthy families began hiring guards to protect burial sites. Some historical accounts suggest that certain deaths that appeared natural may have been expedited to meet market demand, though we'll leave those implications in the realm of historical speculation. But here's the twist that makes all of this even more disturbing. None of these practices ended because people suddenly developed better morals. They ended because of a moment of collective self-recognition that changed everything. Case File 1. The moment everything changed. And now we reach the case that forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truth in this entire investigation. Throughout most of human history, the practices we've been discussing weren't considered aberrant or immoral. They were normal. They were prescribed by doctors, sanctioned by religious authorities, and practiced by the most respected members of society. The shift in moral perception happened gradually, but the tipping point was when European explorers encountered the dietary practices of certain isolated communities and suddenly realized that they were looking in a mirror. The same Europeans who routinely consumed human-derived medicines were horrified to discover other cultures engaging in similar practices for different reasons. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could consuming human organs for medical purposes be civilized and moral, while consuming them for nutritional purposes be savage and evil? The logical inconsistency forced European society to confront the reality of what they had been doing for centuries. Step out of these cursed archives, and the implications become impossible to ignore. We've just traced a historical pattern where some of humanity's most respected institutions spent centuries systematically normalizing practices that we now consider among the most horrific crimes imaginable. This isn't just about weird historical diets or cultural differences in food preferences. This is about discovering that the moral frameworks we assume are fundamental to human nature are actually fragile recent constructions that can collapse under pressure with terrifying speed. The practices we've examined weren't aberrations committed by desperate outcasts. They were standard operating procedures endorsed by the most educated, wealthy, and powerful members of society. If university-trained physicians, ordained priests, and crowned royalty could spend centuries consuming human remains while considering themselves paragons of civilization, what does that tell us about the reliability of any society's moral certainties? Modern food production raises uncomfortable questions when viewed through this historical lens. Factory farming practices that we consider normal today might horrify future generations, the same way medieval medicine horrifies us. The environmental and ethical costs of industrial meat production are becoming harder to ignore, but we've developed elaborate justification systems to avoid confronting those costs directly. Climate change is creating new pressure points that could test our moral frameworks in ways we haven't anticipated. If rising seas and changing weather patterns create massive food shortages, how quickly might our comfortable ethical positions become flexible survival strategies? The siege survival patterns we examined earlier suggest that moral boundaries are more fragile than we want to admit. Perhaps most unsettling is recognizing how cultural blind spots allow societies to normalize the unthinkable. Medieval Europeans didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as advanced civilized people making rational decisions based on the best available information. They had elaborate philosophical and religious frameworks that made their choices seem not just acceptable, but admirable. What current practices are we normalizing through similar cultural blind spots? Future historians might look back at our era and wonder how we could have been so blind to obvious moral atrocities that we justified through elaborate intellectual frameworks. What struck you most about these historical examples? How do they change your perspective on modern food production, medical ethics, or cultural taboos? And perhaps most importantly, what current practices do you think future generations might judge as harshly as we judge medieval medicine? Let me know in the comments, and remember, the past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered.